Okay, so we are kind of in the midst of one of our standards that focuses on the post-war War of 1812 period. And one of the big highlights that we have to focus on, and I don't mean highlights in a positive way, but one of the highlighted events that we have to focus on has to do with the Missouri Compromise. And we've gone through this text already, but one of the things I want to do is I want to emphasize certain parts of the text as we move forward, because one of the things that we are going to do today is go over the four multiple choice four multiple choice questions, and then I'm going to prompt you on the very last question, which is the open-ended question. I have specific instructions for that I want you to follow, so please do not start that yet, okay? So we're dealing with two different topics here. We're dealing with this idea of westward expansion, and we're dealing with the growing concern about the two positions of slavery, those who are for slavery and those who are against it. This map is kind of interesting. It's a little bit farther down the road because it's hard to tell in the screen. I'll kind of zoom in for you, but California is a state here. It's a free state. All the states in pink are free. All the states in blue are slave states. The irony about this is that most maps that you see that show slave states and free states have the color schemes reversed. In other words, in a lot of maps, the free states are blue and the slave states are red. So it's kind of interesting. But you'll see Iowa and Wisconsin and Michigan are added here as well. And then you'll see Texas was added. So we know this is after 1850 because that's when California becomes a state. But I just wanted to point it out. One of the things that makes this such a troubling time is that it's such a divided period already in American history. And we're talking about 40 years or so before the Civil War, okay? And so one of the things I want to point out again is, and I'm going to kind of annotate some of the areas of text that I want you to annotate as well. And really it starts out with this sentence right here. While most white Americans agreed that the expansion was crucial, that means the country expansion was crucial to the health of the nation, they couldn't agree about what should be done about slavery in the West. Health of the nation has to do with the stability of the nation, prosperity, could be economic prosperity. And also the thing is that, countries, the more land that you can display as yours, the more power that you have in the world. And it's part of the reason why France and Britain were constantly fighting each other for territory all over the world, kind of like imperialism, which we see kind of go up and down throughout American history, periods where it's really big and where it's really low. So we know that's successful, but one of the things that makes our situation much more dire compared to Britain is that we have the issue of slavery. Britain does not have that issue. France does not have that issue, okay? Both countries have already eliminated slavery to this point. And so we know that there's a very sharp divide on this issue because we've been adding states in as pairs for many years now to keep that balance. And again, I'm going to come back to that again about this balance of slave states and free states quite a bit, but it is pivotal to maintaining some kind of agreement on so many issues involving the country at this time, because the fear is that the pro-slavery faction or the anti-slavery faction will gain that momentum, will gain that advantage and use that power to create legislation or create laws that could have a long-term impact on slavery. For example, if we have one, if Missouri is added as a slave state and that's it, there's not another state to balance it out, then we have 12 slave states and 11 free states. So that's 2 extra votes in the Senate for states that are for slavery, and they could use that to maybe say, we're going to allow slavery to go into any new territory we gain out west. And that could be a huge explosive issue because more and more people are coming to the side of seeing slavery as immoral, while we still continue to have and will emphasize a huge number of people that see slavery as a state right and as a part of their identity in the South, okay? And the thing that makes it interesting is that when we see what's going on here in the Constitutional Convention, And we talked about this compromise that is mentioned. If you look at the footnotes, it's talking about the one first crisis of how slaves were going to be counted in the population, ending in what results in the 3/5 compromise. That's really the only stance that has taken place regarding anything to do with slavery, because one of the things I mentioned to you is that the founders that were very much a part of that Constitutional Convention were very much a part of the creation of that foundation, the most important part of the country, did not want the issue of slavery to become so divisive that it threatened the existence of the country overall. That's why you don't see major changes and major decisions being made on the issue of slavery that could threaten division, threaten a civil war, or anything like that. So it's very much something that the descendants of those founders, the second generation of leaders in the country and third generations, had to deal with the most. And again, when we see here in this last paragraph on the first page, Missouri's entrance threatened to ruin the balance in favor of slave interests. That's the whole point of what we're talking about here, because if you tip the scale in one direction or another, you threaten a crisis where the other side could threaten secession. That threat of secession, which is like an ultimate betrayal of the country, is something that's not going to go away. I mean, we've heard it being brought up during the War of 1812 with the states and the Federalist Party in the Northeast. We're going to hear it numerous times moving forward, especially in southern states like South Carolina, that are threatening to secede from the Union if their states' rights are being in their way violated. And that's a big thing here of what we're talking about. We are talking very much about a state versus federal right issue. In other words, is the issue of slavery going to be controlled more at the federal level, or is it going to be controlled more at the state level? And that argument back and forth is so much of what we're looking at here. All right. And so this question right here, to me, is one of the most important questions of this text right here. I emphasize this so much because could Congress deny a state the right to decide for itself whether or not to allow slavery? So when we see this circumstance involving a state right, we are talking about a state right to decide equals what's called popular sovereignty. And this is a topic that is rooted in controversy. I'm sorry that it kind of cut off there and it's like a, fragmented word. But this is this idea of popular sovereignty, it has such a huge impact in this century because people are very concerned that the federal government is going to create laws or amendments to the Constitution that will threaten the existence of slavery. And slave owners in the South feel that slavery is their moral right because they look at slavery as property and they equate that to the federal government and the Constitution having to protect their rights. That's what it comes down to. That is the quintessential argument that leads to the Civil War. Everything is rooted and is associated with slavery, but it's very much about, is the federal government going to overstep its authority, according to a slave owner in the South, and take away my right to my property? And that ultimately is what happens to lead to the Civil War. Because when Abraham Lincoln's elected in 1860, the South sees Lincoln as someone who will eventually come in and say, slavery no more in Alabama, slavery no more in Arkansas, slavery no more in North Carolina. And then it'll just be over. Their entire identity, their entire livelihood and society and way of life will change. That's what it comes down to. Okay, you can look at any event that is considered a cause of the Civil War, and it all goes back to that same idea. All right. And one of the thing we have to understand here, again, when we're dealing with this word compromise, is we know that we have two very polarizing viewpoints here that aren't going to be willing to give up too much for what they want. And this compromise is not going to fully benefit or fully make the North or the South or the pro-slavery or anti-slavery sides happy. This is so much more about finding middle ground at a time where the country is beginning to fracture more and more, and we're just trying to apply that Band-Aid on that wound. Now, a lot of people could argue that they could have handled the situation better. They could have dealt with the situation involving slavery better, but ultimately, it is amazing to see that this solution lasts for a significant amount of time. All right, it lasts for over 30 years. And then we get into a whole new controversy with this 1854 law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And I want to pause here and talk about this for a moment, because one of the things that is so interesting about this law, this Kansas-Nebraska law, is that this is essentially the reason why Abraham Lincoln becomes a politician again. And I know we haven't talked about Lincoln yet, but I love to talk about the reasoning behind this, okay? So I'm just going to give you a brief story about Abraham Lincoln. Once upon a, no, I'm not going to do that. Lincoln was a member of the House of Representatives. He was elected in the mid 1840s. I believe it was even 1846 when he was elected. And when he was elected to the House of Representatives, the U.S. was just in the process of declaring war on Mexico, really because the U.S. wanted that huge amount of territory in the southwestern part of the United States. And what happened is Lincoln was very, very vocal in his opposition to the war because he felt it was provoked. And one of the things that he was very concerned about, like many people, was that getting all this land from Mexico would end up being a situation where slavery could be allowed to expand further. Okay. Now, he only served one term in the House of Representatives. Yes, Mason.
Isn't the war with Mexico where we got Texas?
Well, the Texas Revolution actually predates the rest of. So basically, this more or less is the boundary between Texas and the rest of the Mexican territory. This we acquired by force, but it was not technically part of the Mexican War, which happens in 1846. So we actually admit Texas as a state essentially right before the war with Mexico begins. But it's very much still dealt with the same situation involving aggression towards Mexico. So yes, that's partly true. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So Lincoln he doesn't get reelected for his opposition. He goes back to Springfield and he practices law in Springfield, Illinois. He's a private practice lawyer. Well, then here comes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically says that the Missouri Compromise no longer applies, this line no longer applies, and all this land up here is up for grabs. So this land that I circled basically is no longer free territory. It can be determined whether it will be slave or free by popular sovereignty. And he, like so many people, were up in arms for this. And many people that were in his former party, the Whig Party, WHIG, formed a new political party called the Republican Party in 1854. And this party came about immediately after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, specifically for one purpose, and that was not to allow slavery to grow bigger, to stop the expansion of slavery. And that's why he became a very vocal and major part of that political party. That's how Lincoln got involved in politics again, and that's where the origins of the Republican Party began. Now, everybody asks me this question all the time. Does that mean it's the same as the political party today? No, neither political party, Democrat or Republican, is really anything like it is today. It's very different because the circumstances were far different. The events of history were far different. The overall politics of the time were different. It's a totally different era in history. But I just wanted to point that out because a lot of times we look at the circumstances of why events happen and what the repercussions are. That's one that is always a big one. All right. And this, to me, Kansas-Nebraska is one of those laws that really I think is like top two of why the war started. I mean, it's really like a domino effect because the Missouri Compromise happens. There's going to be ongoing tension, and then a next event happens, and then a next event. And we just know that it's one thing after another, but you're going to be constantly in this crisis period because of the circumstances surrounding deep polarization and division in the country, okay? And because of what's going on, one of the strategies that leaders in the African American community, both in the free African American and slave communities, are they're trying to expose the division in the country and utilize that to express their concerns and take action on the issue of slavery. And so that's why we see revolts and revolutions happening widely. All right. Some of these are successful, others are not. And the one with Denmark Vesey is interesting because, like many, it never was able to be successful because of a betrayal. And what that means is that someone spoke and someone told somebody that this was going to happen because they found out. And usually, you know, these revolts and rebellions were kept very close to the vest, which means you're not going to tell people what's going on, because the less people that know until the very last minute, the better. Otherwise, these get exposed. And so what happens is someone told the militia leaders in Charleston, South Carolina, that this was going to happen, and they were able to defy the goal of this rebellion to take the Charleston Arsenal. Okay. And we know that the reaction by white slave owners is going to be very aggressive in their mind to make a point, because we do know that slave owners are on the defensive because they think they see two things happening here. They see this group of people in the North, the northern free states, putting pressure on them on the issue of slavery. And that can be abolitionists, it could be private citizens, it could be members of Congress. And I just so you know, the number of abolitionists is not a humongous number. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Okay. The percent, you know, the abolitionist group is a minority among the population, even in the North and especially in the South. You would not be an outspoken abolitionist in the South. It would be too dangerous. But in addition to that, the South is also aware that if there are going to be revolts and rebellions, they have to be on high alert, because they are in a very precarious situation, because African Americans in the South could at any time lead a rebellion or a revolt, because by the time the Civil War starts, folks, there are 4 million enslaved African Americans in the South. And one of the huge advantages that the Union had over the Confederacy is that they, or I should say, one of the major disadvantages that the Confederacy had in the South is they had a huge percentage of their population that at any moment could revolt and cause major disruption during the war. It really is amazing that we don't have humongous major revolts or rebellions going on during the Civil War by the part of African Americans. It's very interesting, because that would have been a huge blow to the South. All right. But here's the thing that's interesting. As the concern over the West continues, we do know that African Americans are going to find more opportunities to take the issue at hand that causes massive division and use that to their advantage to promote their agenda on what they want to do. Because a divisive nation makes it very difficult, or very easy for them to get the word out, to take action in a very profound and powerful way. Okay. So I want to talk about the multiple choice questions. And I want to go over these together so we can because these are good questions, but I want to make sure we're on the same page here. And then I'm going to talk about what we're going to do for question number 5. Okay. So we're going to go over these together, and I would encourage people to participate in raising their hands and telling me which answers they chose. Okay. So let's look at part A, because 1 and 2 are connected. All right. How does the Missouri Compromise and slave revolution interact within the text? So those two ideas, the Missouri Compromise and the slave revolution, how are they kind of intertwined, or how do they interact in the text? So what answer choice do you think is the best for number 1? Okay, Ailuan?
Maybe B.
Yeah, I would agree with D, because I think C and D have some similarities, and you could even argue to some extent that C would be the best answer, but D is going to be the most important, because you have people that oppose the Missouri Compromise, and then African American leaders are going to use that opposition as motivation for their revolt and make that their mission to be effective at a time when we have much divisiveness. Again, if the Missouri Compromise was more supportive, we may not have seen the action being taken. Let's go to number 2, which is a supplement for question 1, but we're looking at part B here. Which phrase from the text best supports the answer to part A? What do you think is the best one there? Let's see here. Joffer, what do you think on number 2? What do you think is the best answer choice for number 2?
C.
Yeah, I would agree with C as well. And the reason why is because if you look at it, they, African Americans realize that the priorities are not for their well-being, unfortunately. The priorities of those leaders in Congress is for their own interests at heart. And so they know that they had to take advantage of these situations to promote what they want and not depend on, congressional leaders, white congressional leaders to make changes for them or on their behalf. Let's look at number 3. How does this sentence from paragraph 5 contribute to the central ideas of the text? We're talking about main ideas here. Quote, the debate was especially ironic because defenders of slavery relied on a central principle of fairness. So what do we think here? For number 3. How about Violet? Would you mind telling me what you think for number 3?
Is it A?
A? Yes, A is correct. There is a distinct contradiction between the goals of the states versus what's the goals for African Americans. And again, we know that unfortunately, congressional leaders are not looking out for the well-beings of African Americans first and foremost. They're looking out for the well-beings of their own state populations and goals, okay? All right, last multiple choice question, and then I'm going to talk about question 5. Which statement best describes a central idea of the text? I think this is my favorite question of the 4. Mason?
I'm thinking B on this one.
Yeah, B, I agree. And the reason why is that this phrasing right here is really clearly evident in the text, because there are deep divides that exist in the country that may not have been as evident before, but these laws clearly show it. This law clearly shows that we are a country that, the population is very split and very divided on this issue. And the fact that we are in such a fragile state about balance from these two groups, pro and anti-slavery, plays such a big role in what we're talking about here, okay? All right, now, listen carefully, please. I realize that this question is on this document, but I don't want you to be answering question 5 on this document. So what I want you to do is I want you to go back to the course page, okay? And what you're going to do is I'm going to publish the exit ticket just right now. You are going to be completing question 5. Please listen carefully. You're going to be completing question 5 as the exit ticket today. We will submit the multiple choice questions at a later time. But right now, what I want you to do is refresh the page and go back to the exit ticket for today. And what you'll see there is this question. It's the same question that's on number 5 on the text, but this is where I want you to answer it. Okay? So according to the author, how did the Missouri Compromise lay the groundwork for the Civil War? Provide evidence from the text in your answer. So let me give you a little bit of clarification here. So please listen carefully. This phrasing could also be said as another way to say it is, how did the Missouri Compromise set the stage for the Civil War? how can we look at the compromise as signaling a later civil war or knowing that a civil war will be coming later? Okay, so if lay the groundwork doesn't make sense to you, hopefully those other explanations do. Now, here's the key. You are welcome to do this as a race prompt. You don't have to, but you do have to provide evidence from the text. And let me clarify what I don't want you to do. If you are answering the question and you say, according to the text, da 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 da, when you're explaining the connection between the text that you are finding and the answer, don't just regurgitate the quote, because a lot of times when you're having to do the explanation of how the text is connected, a lot of times people just say, and this shows how, or this quote shows how, and what you end up doing is just basically paraphrasing what the quote says. I would like you to make a connection with an explanation, because I want to see that you can demonstrate to me that you understand in the reading that this is very much talking about an issue that will show how the country is so fractured that the war will take place. Yes, Sinead.
How many pieces of evidence should we use?
I would say at least two is ideal, because the text kind of goes into so many different subtopics and sub discussions that I think that it's important that we hit on multiple. And again, don't go about this, folks, in a very vague way. Don't go about it saying, you know, the Missouri Compromise showed that the country was divided and we couldn't get along, and that's because, you know, some people, thought slavery was a good thing. Some people, that's just too vague. You know, I need to see that you understand the text, you understand the situation and the circumstances going on in the country, and that takes you to that next step in understanding why we could see this as one of the many circumstances that will eventually lead to the country to war. Okay. And I do like the phrasing laying the groundwork more than just a cause, because there are so many causes of a civil war and it's not a singular situation. Okay. Does anybody have any questions before we depart? I just want to make sure we understand, excuse me. You need to make sure you are utilizing pieces of the text and responding to this, and you're responding to this in the text box or in a file upload. If you want to type this, if you want to do it as a Google Doc and submit it, that's fine. If you want to do it, I just need to make sure that I can read it. Sometimes when we do a certain file type, I can't open it. All right, you can do a screenshot, you can do it in a notes screenshot, or just do the text. That would be the easiest, okay? Any questions before we depart? All right, I would like you to have this done, if you can, by the end of the day today, please. And I will see you tomorrow at 12 noon. We're going to be transitioning to start talking about the Monroe Doctrine and foreign policy. And Mr. Hayslip is going to be introducing that topic for us. So I will talk to you then. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.